You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday the 13th of December. I am Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. And what better day to talk about unexplained phenomenon, scary things like court filings and legal proceedings and things that you don't understand the complicated nature of because you don't need to until you're embroiled in it, whether it be hopefully not personally, or because you're a working journalist and you've got to understand something that you woke up knowing nothing about, and by the end of the day explain it to an audience in a way that is succinct enough that they will understand it. So we had one of those stories this week, and that brings us to who's sitting with me today, which is Sydney Canty. Now, Sydney, this week, the story that sparked this is a very dense legal reasoning in a settlement, or not a settlement, I'm sorry, a lawsuit between Trumbull and Lake counties and a string of pharmacy chains where they had previously already won $650 million for these pharmacies' alleged role in the opioid crisis.
Right.
Now, already, just saying that, my eyes are glossing over, and we haven't even gotten into the complicated part yet. And so that's what this is. So when you wake up in the morning, that's kind of the nature of this business, though, is you might need to be able to adapt to something that is really hard to wrap your head around. So before we get into the specifics of that case, I just want to talk about that, how you have to approach every day. How do you explain something to someone by 6 o'clock or by 5 o'clock that you'd never heard of when you woke up at whatever time you wake up? I get up at 4, but I've got to beat, I'm sure.
Some days it is not without great difficulty. It's a lot of, okay, let me figure out what exactly this means. Sometimes I'll have to read it to myself over and over, especially if there's legal jargon involved. They use a lot of extra words that I feel are unnecessary, but are, necessary for their purposes, I suppose. And you kind of really have to make sure that everything that you are reading, you are digesting yourself, because we're the news. We can't get it wrong. There is no, well, we're human. No, we can't get it wrong. So it's a lot of reading and then doing research on it, doing background on it, and really working together with, our colleagues and making sure that we can understand everything correctly. I can remember even yesterday, after I thought that I digested everything, I wrote in my introduction something that you said was way off of.
Well, and we can talk about that. Mm-hmm. I tell people that, you just, first of all, this is contrary to what anybody thinks about this being. I think some people think that being on television is a glamorous thing. There are people who use terms like media elites. Listen, the bottom line is you have to check your ego at the door and recognize that if I'm going to try and fake it and pretend like I'm the smartest guy in the room, I'm going to get something wrong, and the humbling is going to come hard and fast, and I'm not going to get very far in this field. So set it aside and be willing to ask people questions. If you're not willing to do that and make it clear you don't understand, then that's going to be a failure right out of the gate that's just going to snowball. Mm-hmm. So, this is going back a number of years now, but there's a famous movie from the 90s with Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington called Philadelphia. Have you ever seen that movie?
I was born in the 90s.
Well, it's a classic. It was Hanks' first Oscar. Anyways, in the movie, Denzel plays Hanks's lawyer, and there's several scenes throughout when he's doing his lawyer thing where he'll say to somebody, I need you to explain this to me like I'm a 6-year-old. I say that to people all the time. I mean, just carry that with you forever. Mm-hmm. It's fine to acknowledge you don't understand something. It's not fine to fake it and pretend. Right. This is what you see a lot of people, and this gets to the core of this podcast, is that's what people on social media do. They fake it, they think they understand things, they've done no real work, and they just sort of spout off. Obviously not everybody, but that's the difference, is we can't do that.
Right, yeah.
So let's talk about yesterday's story to start with. Mm-hmm. Now, me to explain it, or you want to explain it?
It doesn't matter. I can explain it. Okay, so Lake and Trumbull counties decided to file a lawsuit against CVS, against Walgreens, against Walmart, these major national pharmacies for what they say was kind of destroying their communities by sending out opioids, and these were prescribed, but pushing them into the communities kind of recklessly is the way that they were looking at this, and attributing to the opioid epidemic. And they filed this under something called public nuisance. And so when the judge heard it, they were like, okay, you know what? This did cause a problem. Here's $650 million. That's your settlement. You guys can use that toward first responder training. You can use it toward treatment and whatever else in that arena.
Before you even continue, I want to stop and just, because that's all correct. But there's a lot that's got to be considered that, like, because you understand it now and because we all understand the story, there's stuff that if you were working on that, you had to understand along the way that you were just able to succinctly say.
Yeah.
So for instance, why the pharmacies? Pharmacies didn't prescribe these. Why would pharmacies be the ones? And so you have to understand that pharmacies are not the only ones, but the argument is that pharmacies are the last line of defense and should have raised a red flag at these overprescribed, some people getting over prescriptions or people shopping around, checking databases, whatever they should have been able to do according to the argument against them. So that's why pharmacies. That's not even a fact that made it into yesterday's story. It was no longer relevant, but you had to understand that going in, right?
Right.
Because otherwise it'd be the first question. I don't get this. So there's that. So then there's also the fact that it was Trumbull and Lake counties because this was what they called a bellwether case.
Right.
So they were testing an area of the law here. So saying that they contributed to a public nuisance is a little bit uncharted. It's not uncharted law, but to use it in this way was uncharted. That's all important knowledge going into yesterday's ruling. Because, now continue.
Okay, because there is a law called the Ohio Product Liability Act. Yes, the Ohio Product Liability Act, and they were supposed to file it under that instead. So before, when there was a after this decision came out, like, here's a $650 million settlement, then the pharmacies are like, absolutely not. We're going to appeal this. Could the courts look at this? Can the Sixth Circuit Court look at this and see?
And this is all federal court. So this is another thing we need to understand that gets complicated, because this suit was in federal court. 6th District is a federal appeals court. Okay, so because that's going to get to another complication. So okay, the Sixth Circuit looks at it.
Unravel here. Gosh,
well, we succinctly explained it yesterday, but we had to understand all of this. So that's why I want to sort of dissect this one. I think it's a good test case to explain how much you have to understand. So okay, so they appealed to the Sixth Circuit.
Right, and they're saying, hey, could you guys check this and make sure this is not an invalid way to have filed the lawsuit in the first place? And then they look at it, and it makes its way to the highest court, the Supreme Court in this state, Ohio Supreme Court.
Back up.
Okay.
Back up, because this is already like, that's actually a little bit off even now. So they appeal it on its merit. They want it thrown out or they want it reduced. So the Sixth Circuit is not just looking at this one area. They're looking at the whole decision. But there's this area of Ohio law that the pharmacies say to the Sixth District, you know, I don't even know that under Ohio law they should have been able to do this. And the Sixth District has to say, you know what? We're a federal court. Maybe that's right. So this whole appeal is on hold because we need the highest court in Ohio. So now state court, not federal court. We need them to take a look at this. So now from federal court to federal appeals court, and this one area kicked to now state court. This is unusual. Did they apply the right area of Ohio law? And that's the only thing they need to know from the Supreme Court of Ohio before they can continue, is just this area of, did they pursue this the proper way in the state of Ohio? In another state, it might have been fine. It might not have even been an argument. But Ohio has the Ohio Product Liabilities Act. Now continue.
Okay. So the Supreme Court looked at that, made that decision on the fact that they did not follow the proper protocol, the one where they should have filed it under the Ohio Product Liability Act instead. And so, that being said, this $650 million settlement is now like up in the air because they have to, if they will go back and file it again, they would have to do that under the Ohio Product Liability Act. And it's not even like guaranteed that they would win it a second time.
When you woke up yesterday, did you ever heard of the Ohio Product Liabilities Act?
No.
And I think I had from a previous story, but I had to refresh myself too. And the Ohio Product Liabilities Act, to put simply, is generally used for things like defective products. You know, like, I mean, if I buy, I don't know, a mixer and my wife is baking and something goes flying off and somebody gets hurt or something, it's a defective product, right? I might be able to sue, she might be able to sue, it's a defective product, and there's law in Ohio that says that if you sell something that hurts you, that this is how you pursue it. That's a lot to wrap your head around, because this is a whole different legal argument now. The opioids had unintended consequences, addictions, overdoses, but they did what they were supposed to do. They weren't defective.
Right.
I mean, they were effective products, maybe too effective, and maybe they had side effects. But that means that if you sue under that, it's an entirely different consideration for a jury to determine if you were injured under that law. It's less, it's obvious. And look, everybody would agree that there's been damage done to communities from the overdose epidemic. That's why it was easy enough for the jury to say that this was a public nuisance. Now they'd have to consider if those products were inherently defective. You've got a completely different case on your hands, right?
Yeah, right. So now the issue is the way they filed this is what was wrong and what ultimately lost them potentially this award. So now, and then there are other pieces to unpack that we couldn't even get into in the package with the other severed parts of this that were, it's just, it was so much to grasp.
Well, that's another key point, is that you will very rarely be able to go into every element of a story. So part of what you've got to do is not only understand it thoroughly, but understand it so thoroughly that you know which ones are relevant and which ones are not. So this ruling yesterday jeopardized the $650 million. So everything else that isn't directly related to that is not unimportant in the courtroom.
Right.
But it's not directly related to the crux, which is that these counties could be out this money now. In fact, they likely are out this money. It's, as we've just described, going to be much, much different and more difficult to prove anything under the Ohio Product Liabilities Act. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Maybe there's a way, but it's not the same as demonstrating that there was a clear public nuisance. Am I right now? Because you spoke to the attorneys.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking of lawyers, Mark Dan is saying what you're saying. He said that it's going to be a lot harder for them to prove up under that act what they're saying is what happened, because there's a lot, you have to go a lot further now with getting that evidence and getting that proof. And it's not going to be where public nuisance, where it's like a kind of like a catch-all, you know, where in Ohio Liability Act, it's very, very hard and very specific to try and get things in there and get that solved and prove that it was exactly what you're saying that it was.
Well, I mean, I think if I'm, and this is me speculating too, so not me being, you know, I'm certainly not a lawyer, but one of the things that you learn covering anything in civil cases is that it basically all comes down to how you demonstrate damages. How were you damaged? Now, if it's the hypothetical mixer I talked about, well, if it worked the way it was supposed to, then there wouldn't have been an injury. If it doesn't, there's an injury. I can demonstrate damages. I could demonstrate that there was damage to the public in that the opioid epidemic was a public problem. It was a public nuisance.
Right.
So I can demonstrate that there's harm. But if I'm going under OPLA, then I would think that the pharmacies, the opioid makers, whoever I want to sue on those grounds could say, yeah, there's harm, but harm is done by misuse. Maybe it's the doctor's fault for overprescribing. Maybe it's your fault for not taking as prescribed. Maybe it's, you know, maybe it's whoever, you know, you got an injury from to begin with that led to you needing the pills.
And how are you going to prove that?
Right. It's not clear, but the only thing that they would say is clear is that these pills work as they're supposed to when taken as directed.
Yeah.
Well, now you can agree, all parties can agree on the damage caused and not agree on on what caused the damage. And you do not have the same case.
Yeah.
Or likely the same outcome.
You even have a case at this point, because I mean, how are you going to prove any of that? You know, it becomes really, really, really difficult, like Mark Dan was saying. So, and then also since we're on the topic of the lawyers, when we have gathered the information and we feel like we've grasped it, I got to a point where I was like, okay, I felt like I've grasped this, and you were saying, let's go and make sure we talk to legal representation who can lay this out for us and the viewers. And I'm like, okay, that's a great idea. And, you know, we've tried different places, people in Trumbull County that said it's too close. And then it's like, well, what do you do at that point? Then it comes to kind of putting the minds together and trying to find any legal representation that could weigh in, not just on what the next steps might be in a situation like this, but really whittling it down and feeding it to the viewers in a way that is clear and concise for them, you know?
Right. Well, and also just quite frankly, making sure you're right. You know,
Yes.
again, setting aside that arrogance, I can read something and say, well, it seems to me like the most important part is this. But then I can talk to an expert who goes, no, that's actually not nowhere near as significant as you think. Here's why. And open your eyes to something you never would have thought of because you're not the expert.
Right.
We have to be sort of renta experts. And that's tough because we're not an expert in the morning. We may not retain all of it by the next day, but we should retain as much as possible. It will inform us. So basically, the longer you act as a journalist, the more worldly you become and the more capable of doing these kinds of stories you become. But only if you never, that can be dangerous in and of itself. You start to think you know everything.
Yeah.
You know, there's two kinds of journalists who are ripe to fail badly. One is somebody new out of the gate thinking that the best way to prove themselves is to act like they know things and sort of fake it till they make it. Because it's going to take somebody like a seasoned journalist to say, you know, listen, kid, you're BSing and I know it, and here's how I know it. Or one who's been at it so long that they start to get cynical and they've seen it all and they've done it all, so they start to think that they know it all. You never know it all.
Never know it all.
You basically approach all of this. There have been legal issues. We're only talking about legal, but this is for everything. We came through a pandemic. We had to cover virology.
Yes.
Did we know virology?
No. And you guys had to cover pyrolysis. Did you know pyrolysis?
I know. Does anybody know what pyrolysis is? The process by which you would take source material, feedstock as they call it, and in the case of the stories we did, tire chips, and heat them up to convert them to energy. And we did a half-an-hour broadcast and several follow-up stories on whether or not this process was safe. And in order to do that, we better understand the process. We had to comb the world for the best experts we could find and figure out what it meant. And then assess if we were talking to the best experts. So for instance, yesterday with this story, we had to find a lawyer. Well, we did have to find a lawyer who knew something about Ohio law. Now, we called lots of them, and some were available, you know, some just weren't available, some were too directly involved. So you mentioned Mark Dan. Well, Mark Dan is not directly involved in this case, but he's a former attorney general for the state of Ohio. So yes, he's familiar with Ohio law and where this one comes in. So a legitimate source. When it was the pandemic, there were a lot of armchair experts out there that you wouldn't talk to, some of whom had credentials that otherwise would have made them legit to talk to. You had to make these decisions as to who to weed out. You started to trust certain people, keep others at arm's length. This is true in every field, but you've got to have the confidence to do that. So you better talk to a lot of people. I mean, can you think of some other areas? You mentioned pyrolysis, I mentioned virology. I mean, what are some other stories that were like, oh my Lord, I don't know?
Freaking property taxes. I hate property taxes. Okay, every time I have to do a story on property, I have to learn about appraised value and assessed value and things that only my dad only ever had to worry about in my household. So those are the hardest stories to me, even still to this day. And then we have to work together, and we have to work with Ralph Meacham or whoever it would be some
kind of a CPA.
Yes, you know. Yes. And then sometimes I would get to the end of the day, and I'm still like, I don't understand this, and then it's just that's definitely to this day still one of the hardest ones for me.
I would agree, and I would even take it further in anything that involves math. It's just.
I agree, yeah.
It's rare that you find a journalist that is really, really good at math.
True.
You know, there's just a different part of your brain, and you probably didn't develop the math side if you were developing the skill set that they're not directly related skill sets generally. So don't trust your own math.
Yeah.
Somebody should check your math.
Yeah.
Somebody should make sure you understand it. Ask people, property tax stories, that's actually a really great example because it's hard for us to understand, and even a lot of the people who are affected, you hear them say things that are not exactly right.
Right.
For instance, and I can't speak for every county, but I can speak from Mahoning County, I hear people all the time talk about how everybody's property taxes went up exponentially this year. And that is not true. But it is true for some.
Yes.
Because there's this very complicated formula. I think once you understand it, it may not be that complicated. It basically has to do with where you live and which levies are in place. But there's also a formula that regulates so that in some places, if this goes up, this goes down, and in other places. The bottom line is, in Mahoning County, it broke up into thirds. And about a third of Mahoning County residents actually saw a reduction in their property taxes. They're just not upset about it, so you don't hear them say it very much because what are you yelling about? I'm not hurt.
Right.
And if they stayed the same, which is what another third did, you probably don't hear from them either. But there is a third where they did go up and they went up a lot. And that's how that formula shakes out, which even as we sit here right now, I cannot remember exactly how that formula worked, but I know that there's state law that regulates so what you voted on, and if you agreed on a levy that would raise a certain amount of money and now your property value went up, well, you can't raise more money than that, so the property taxes have to level out somehow to meet the same amount.
Yeah.
And so it really varies almost household to household, definitely neighborhood to neighborhood. And if I'm going to explain that to people, especially when I've got a lot of people in the audience who are very, very, they're pinched by this and they're hurt, explaining to them that no, it's not true that everybody's went up. You better be able to understand that, because otherwise they're going to think that you're making excuses for a government that they feel is soaking them.
Yeah, and then if we put the wrong information out there, that makes it even worse. Now the people are upset, the community doesn't know what's right and what's wrong, people are confused, and we're getting phone calls, and you have to understand this stuff even if you've never freaking heard of it. So it's just...
And ultimately, everything that you ever get wrong, even if it is the most minor of things, hurts your credibility.
It does.
And if your credibility, we're in the credibility business. If we don't have credibility, even on something small, then people will rightfully question whether they can trust us on big things. That's why this is important. And that's how seriously you have to take it as a journalist. And that the property tax one is also a great example of the difference between social media perception versus reality, because everybody you've ever seen on social media talk about how property taxes went up across the board is really talking about a personal experience that they are universalizing.
Yeah.
They did not, and I don't expect them to. Their personal experience is certainly valid. But it's not the whole story, and if we just said it like that was true. I'll tell you another one that you hear a lot is inflation. People across the board talk about inflation as something that's rising. Now, give or take a few months, and I think even a report that came out today, inflation has been falling steadily for about 2 years. Prices are still high. That's not the same as inflation rising. Inflation's not increasing, it's coming down. Also, prices probably won't ever fall. That's kind of not how that works also. What has to happen to offset it is wages have to catch up with inflation, and then you don't feel the pinch as much. But you're not looking at a raw price and waiting for it to be lower, because when that happens, that's actually a collapse of the market and is what started the Great Depression. You don't want that. You want to be able to afford things. You don't want them to be cheaper. You want to be able to afford them.
Yeah.
Well, that's another thing that people don't need to understand in their day-to-day life, but we better understand, because our credibility is wrong if we say inflation is rising and then somebody in the know calls us and says, hey, I don't know why we should ever talk to you about anything the legislature's doing again, because you clearly don't understand what you're talking about.
Right.
When you say these things that are just talking points on the street or on social media. All of which is to say that not everybody is, not all information is created equal.
Right, right.
And when you hear things like, you, the citizen, are the media now, that sounds great, that sounds empowering, but only if you, the citizen, are going to do that kind of heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you juggle that with family responsibilities and a day job and having to put food on the table. That's why
we're here.
We're here.
Yeah. No, it's definitely difficult. It does take a lot of work, but I like that we all kind of work together. If there's something that I understand or something that you understand that I don't, like, we can work together and put our minds together and figure out how we can make it simple. A lot of times I'm very, very wordy. You have to whittle down a lot of the things that I put into my stories because I will say everything and it doesn't, maybe things can be you just told me this week, you can paraphrase, like you don't have to always say everything exactly the way that it was said. And so it does take a lot of work. It is really important work that we're doing, and it's teamwork more than anything. It is. And
it has to be. It has to be a collaborative process.
Yeah.
Because too wordy can be just hard to follow.
Mm-hmm. Overwhelming.
I have certainly seen people use too wordy also, and I'm not saying that you do this, but I've seen people use too wordy as a cover for not understanding something. Like, well, it's got to be in there somewhere, right? But no, that's usually, like, when people use too many words that way, that's usually a rookie mistake. But if you've got the confidence to understand it, you can whittle it down and it can be understandable. And then just another, to come back to a point you brought up earlier about the lawsuit, the thing that you said you thought you understood and then I had to correct it at the end, because I said we'd get back to that. It was a simple word. It was one word. I believe you said that they cleared these companies for their role in the opioid epidemic. There was no ruling by the Ohio Supreme Court on fault at all. It was only a procedural matter. The end result is probably them not having to pay that $650 million, but it's not because the Supreme Court said, no, they're in the right. It's totally this technical procedure. That seems so sort of subtle, but it's a big, big difference because it has to do with whether or not they can be sued again. It has to do with whether or not they are exonerated and can say that they were unfairly maligned. They could countersue if they were cleared, potentially. I mean, maybe not in this case, but in some cases, you could sue for malicious prosecution, right? There's a lot. So being cleared means a lot. And that's not what happened yesterday. And yet the end result might be the same as if they were cleared in practical terms.
And that comes back to really just making sure you fully understand it before you put it out there. Even toward the end of the day, I'm still asking you questions and putting stuff in there and learning as I'm writing, and it is a lot.
And this process is always collaborative. We right up to the fact that we go through script review for every story, and it's not because we don't trust you. I mean, when somebody's new, they need script review because they haven't done this before, and you need to make sure that they're doing everything properly. But we look over the scripts of people who've been here years and years, and there's almost always some tweak that can be made to improve the understandability of it. And I do it with web stories too. Now there's a higher volume of web stories, so there are more people that have to oversee them, and sometimes they are looked at again after the fact and updated. But it's not because I'm a control freak. I am, but that's not why I do that. I just, I'm looking them over. Robert's looking them over. Sheila's looking them over. Rachel's looking them over. Because it needs to go through more than one set of eyes. And you know what? If for no other reason, then how many times have you seen or heard, I will have looked over a script and say, I think it's good, but you know what? This one's a little dense. So I'll grab someone who has not worked on the story at all and say, I don't need you to worry about grammar or any of that. I've done all of that now. But tell me if you understand this story. Read it back to me. Tell me what this story means after you've read it. And then I know that we're okay. But you get so in the weeds. that it's like, well, now I fully understand it. I
Right.
understand it so well that I'm no longer sure I can explain it.
I've been there, yeah. Yeah, and because we've been looking at it all day and reading about it, researching it, talking to experts, talking to each other, staying in contact and putting the whole thing together, we know it. And then when you try to push it out there to somebody else, it could be like, what is all, glossy eyes, like what is all of this?
Right.
You know, because we know, like you said, we've been in the weeds and these, but we're presenting it to them and it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's so much information. And you guys do a lot of that with 101 West too, where you have to really like the one that Madison, you guys did with Sobe, the very first one. I was like, that was so much information and you guys made it so clear, but it didn't start that way, you know? And I know because Madison was talking to me about it and I was just like, Madison, girl, good luck to you. Because it was so much information and you guys just made it.
But that's spending all the time. That's talking. First of all, it's finding multiple experts who don't necessarily agree on everything, because you can fall into the risk of cherry picking your experts if you're not careful. You know, they have to be credible and willing to differ on certain key points, because not everything is lockstep clear. So you could say, you know, now some would argue this, some would argue that, and they're both valid arguments, but be able to assess that they're both valid arguments and one's not just making garbage up, right?
Or connected to it in some way that you didn't know about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, particularly 101 West, because it is such an in-depth process. I mean, that's days and days of poring over every word of a script. But the way we'll do that generally is we're going over what we need to know, what the story needs to be able to explain. Then the reporter working on it will go and gather that and come back with a draft of a script. Well, now, you know, you need to explain that to us. And by us, it's, you know, me and Sheila and Robert. But then answer questions as we go. We're going to pick it apart. We're not picking it apart to be difficult. We're picking it apart because if there's so much as a syllable that isn't clear, then our credibility is on the line.
Yeah.
And it's a painstaking process. You get a migraine from it. But the end result is far, 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 far more reliable than someone with an opinion based on something they read on one website that they already knew they were going to agree with when they went to it, which is most of what you get on social media, some sites more so than others.
True. Yeah. Painstaking process indeed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we could go on and on because every day there's some kind of a story. You have to learn the court system. You have to learn how to read an affidavit. You have to learn a civil suit. You have to learn different kinds of science. You have to learn virology. You have to, I don't know what I might have to learn. We've had to learn rail safety. We had to, you know, you'd have to learn any number of things. What's your overall message to people about what they don't know about that, about what we do?
My overall message, I would say the behind the scenes work that we do for the viewers is truly a service that is so needed in our community, that we take our time to do, that we sift through line by line, word by word, documents and official papers and even people that we have to vet to make sure that we're putting the best possible product out there. And my overall message is that we're going to continue to do that. It's hard and it's not always fun, but it's necessary. And we do it because we have to and we should.
I would say that for every minute and a half you see on television, there is roughly 9 to 10 hours worth of work that went into that minute and a half.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
And not just one person's 9 to 10 hours worth of work, but like 9 to 10 hours worth of probably 3-4 people working on something. And that's not something that I think that people generally realize. It's, you know, well, you went and talked to somebody and you reported what they said. And there are outlets that do that, but they're doing a disservice. That's not digging into a subject. That's just repeating what somebody said.
Yeah.
That's not journalism.
And there are days and days and days worth of work that goes even into the investigations that you guys put out that aren't 101 West.
Months,
the ones
weeks
that are,
and months. Yeah, no, I'm talking about your average everyday story
ones.
is 9 to 10 hours worth of work for every minute and a half. When you get into the deeper dive stuff, you're talking weeks and months worth of work. And then when you get into your half an hour shows like 101 West, Yeah, no, incredibly intensive. I mean, the next one will have had, well, when all is said and done, it will have had the better part of a year's worth because of some things. I mean, that's because some things have sidetracked where there have been big things that have happened that have required a shift in attention.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it ever goes away. You keep working on it. With that, we are coming near the end of the year, but we'll get, I think, at least one more of these done before the end, maybe two. If you ever have anything that you think we should be looking into. And also, I never say this at the end of this, but if there are things about the news business that you don't understand that you'd like us to sit here and discuss and explain, please send us an email and just put in the subject line, the Outcue. And we're always looking to, you're so in the weeds, you don't know what people even are thinking about. We're happy to explain anything that goes into news. We think it's important you understand as much as we think it's important that we do it. You can always reach us, news@WFMJ.com, watchdog@WFMJ.com. You can call us at 330-744-8821. You can message us on Facebook. You can message us on Blue Sky. You can send us mail if you want, but that's going to take way longer. And if you do that, please include contact information. There's nothing I hate more than I can't call back this person and I've got a big question over something that I've got 3 pages handwritten on. But any way that you can reach us, we're here to listen and we're here to explain and we're here to do the work for you. And with that, this has been this week's The Outcue.
All right, awesome.
All right.
All right.